Welcome to Lesson 3 in Unit 4, River Rescue. In this lesson, students will work to answer the question, why is the garbage on top of the water? In this lesson, students continue to ask questions and explore the garbage in the water. They make observations and investigate additional properties of the garbage. Some is floating on top of the water, while other garbage isn't. Students figure out that some objects can sink and other objects can float in the water. Items can be sorted by whether they can sink or float. Students make connections to the storyline by continuing to research the problem they are trying to solve. They gather information about sinking and floating to make sense of how the garbage is floating in the water. There are several opportunities for ELA, math, and social studies cross-curricular connections throughout the lesson. You can look for specific standard connections in the Unit 4 teacher guide. This lesson will take approximately 3 days to complete. In the Engage portion of this lesson, you will project the polluted part of the Mississippi River. Then, you will show students the garbage items chart from Lesson 2 and review the categories the class made based on their observable properties. You will facilitate a discussion so that students are able to analyze and observe objects that float in the water and ask questions about objects that sink. During your discussion, take the opportunity to post the float vocabulary card and sink vocabulary card. Next, you will revisit the driving question board. Add any new questions and highlight others connected to the learning goals of this lesson by calling attention to questions about why garbage is on top of the water or if there is also garbage underwater. If no questions directly relate, use prompts to build on student questions, supporting them to make observations at the placement of garbage in the water. In the Explore portion of this lesson, you will set up the sink or float investigation by providing each group with a clear container filled halfway with water. You can find detailed instructions and a tutorial linked in the teacher guide. You can pause this video to review the materials needed for this investigation. This investigation is an opportunity to formatively assess your students. See the assessment tracker for guidance. You will work with students to set up the investigation procedure the class will follow. You will begin the investigation by showing students the bag of objects and asking, how could we investigate which items sink and which items float? How could we keep track of the items that sink or float? How might we record our data about which items sink and which items float? During your discussion, take the opportunity to post the data vocabulary card. To continue the investigation, you will put students into groups of 3 or 4. Have them observe the items and make a prediction about whether they will sink or float using the Sink or Float Prediction Student Journal pages. Then, they will complete the investigation by placing each object into the tank of water and recording their observations as data on the Sink or Float Data Student Journal pages. Students should observe that some items float and some items sink. The bottle, cap, ping pong ball, and foil float, and bouncy ball, bell, and clay sink. Items that are light, flatter, or hollow float. Items that are heavier or more bulky sink. It is not always easy to tell just from looking at them which items will float and which will sink. Sometimes we have to test out our ideas to observe more properties. The plastic bottle will float when it is empty and will sink when it is full of water. The aluminum foil will either float or sink depending on how students place it in the water. If they push it and hold it below the surface of the water, it will sink or be suspended. If they place it on top of the water, it will float. Students can shape the clay in different ways to try to get it to sink or float. In the explain portion of this lesson, you will invite students to gather in a circle to share their findings from the sinking and floating investigation. Use the questions below to guide your discussion around the question, why is the garbage on top of the water? Use the discussion to create the Lesson 3 summary chart. The goal of this class discussion is to make connections between the property of sinking and floating and the garbage in the Mississippi River. Students can use the sink or float data student journal pages to support them in this discussion. By the end of this discussion, students should understand that some objects sink and float. Some properties of sinking were heavy, big, or hard. Some properties of floating were light or empty. Students will be able to understand that there is probably more garbage in the Mississippi River that sinks under the surface of water. In the elaborate portion of the lesson, you will display the pond litter image. Have students pair share to identify and describe one object floating and one object sinking in the pond. Have them use their data from the investigation to brainstorm why the item might be sinking or floating. This is a chance to do a quick check for understanding. See the assessment tracker for further guidance. In the evaluate portion of this lesson, you will project the engineering design cycle to remind students that engineers use this process to identify and solve problems. Have students recall what they have learned about the garbage in the Mississippi River and share what they have learned about this problem. Then, have students return to their In a River student journal page from the anchoring problem to update their drawing by adding garbage floating or sinking in the water. Have students turn and talk to a partner. They should share their drawing and explain what they added and why it is a problem. See the assessment tracker for guidance on this formative assessment. To support student sense making across the unit, orient students back to the driving question board. Ask students, what did we learn about why the garbage is on top of the water? What new questions do you have? Students will probably wonder what the garbage does to all the plants and animals living in the water. This is the topic of the next lesson. By the end of this lesson, students will have made observations to define sinking and floating, and conducted an investigation to make observations about sinking and floating. In Lesson 4, students will continue to think about the problem. They will investigate how garbage in the water affects the surrounding wildlife. For more information about this unit, visit mysitepartners.com.